Depending on who you ask, house prices are either about to boom or about to crash. I've got, right here, the latest data from the ONS, and it tells us the real story of what's going on in the UK property market. We're going to look at the national picture first of all on the average home, and then we'll zoom in on all of the regional data, which I think suggests that there's something going on right now in the UK housing market that I haven't seen happen in my lifetime before. We're going to focus on both house prices and rents, and I'm really going to try and give you the full accurate picture here. So the next time you hear someone saying, oh, house prices are going to do this, you've got the numbers.
So what we're looking at is sort of a first.
So the headline figure is that house prices across the UK rose by 2.5% to £271,000 in the 12 months to November. These are provisional figures though. The reason I'm focusing on that provisional point, here on page 4 of the document is this whole section about revisions. And the ONS are coming out and basically saying, we think we've been overvaluing new build homes. I mean, they ain't the only ones, right? But they're suggesting that their new revisions to how they calculate the data might lead to drops in that cohort of homes. It's about 9% of purchases, so they say it's not going to affect the data too much. But it sort of points to the fact of how hard it is to value housing stock across the whole of the UK, because the housing market is probably one of the most complicated markets in the UK. Anyway, coming back to that growth figure. Using this chart, you can see the growth in prices experienced between the end of 2025 and 2016. The only period where house prices actually fell on average is right here at the back end of 2023. And look at that period of growth there around COVID, where stamp duty rates were cut and the housing market just went on that wild race for space mentalness. In the context of this period, the growth that we're seeing today being reported actually looks quite muted, doesn't it? And I just want to draw your attention to the phrasing of this at the top here. House price annual inflation. Inflation is a really important word here because inflation impacts everything that we purchase, including assets, including houses. If I gave you £100,000 in cash and you stuck it in a bank account with a 0% interest rate for 12 months, at the same time inflation was 10%, you know in a year's time you can buy less today than you could before. The real purchasing power of that money has decreased. Houses are sort of like bank accounts. You're just storing your money in bricks instead of in cash. So if house prices go up slower than the rate of inflation, in real terms, the purchasing power of the money stored in those bricks goes backwards. The growth rate of property prices here is 2.5%. But the December number for inflation as measured by CPIH, which I believe is a better measure of inflation because it includes housing costs, is 3.6%. So your average house has increased in price over the last 12 months slower than the rate of inflation. So we can see how this looks on this chart right here that tracks inflation-adjusted house prices all the way back to 1975. The largest growth in house prices in real terms was here from the late 90s. This is when people got the richest in real terms from holding property. We can actually see that the peak in prices was right before the financial crisis. And in today's prices, when adjusted for inflation, we're more in line with around 2013. If we switch to a 10-year view now, we see that the recent trend over the last decade was a massive surge in real prices around COVID, and then this decline back down again more recently. I know this can feel counterintuitive, a little bit of a head scratcher really. You know, you're sitting there going, well, house prices have gone up, so how is this idiot telling me that they've actually gone down? But it's not that they've gone down on paper, it's more that everything around you has got more expensive, so the money stored up in your bricks can now buy less than it could previously. This is often called a silent crash. And in a way, it's politically the best of both worlds, because a drop in values like this doesn't tend to annoy homeowners that much because they simply don't consider or understand the inflation point. So they see 2.5% growth in the headlines and they think, great, I'm richer. But it can at the same time improve the affordability of first-time buyers as they're essentially, potentially, able to catch up if their incomes grow at a rate above inflation. To see if that's the case, we need to now look at first-time buyer affordability.
With price growth well below the rate of earnings growth and a steady decline in mortgage rates, affordability constraints have eased somewhat over the past year, helping to underpin buyer demand.
Whenever these two lines are above zero, the average Brit's pay is increasing above the rate of inflation. So they're getting better off. First of all, just look at this massive stretch post-2008 where UK workers just got poorer in real terms consistently because wage growth failed to beat the rate of inflation. And this deep trough here is the inflation shock we all experienced after COVID. And it's why we all just felt so much poorer so quickly as prices rocketed up. But recently there's been this positive trend of wage growth above the rate of inflation. I just want to say, I'm aware that not everyone is going to be sat here getting pay rises above the rate of inflation at the minute. But the national picture is that wages have increased above inflation for a little while and house prices have not. So that improves affordability for the average first-time buyer. And again, I can feel the average first-time buyer who's struggling to get on the market being like, what are you chatting about? But here's a chart that shows first-time buyers as a percentage of house purchases, and the activity you're seeing from that cohort is essentially the highest it's been in 10 years. And the first-time buyers' price-to-earnings ratio, so how much does the house cost relative to their income, is below the 20-year average for the first time in a long while. But this did get really out of whack right here, and in a lot of parts of the country, it's still out of whack, namely London, where it's outrageous. And finally, UK first-time buyer mortgage payments as a percentage of their income have come down a bit. Still above the long-term average though, but it has improved. It sits at around 32%. Just look at the peak in 1989 where it was nearly 50%. So half of your take-home pay was going on your mortgage. I got charts showing it's getting easier for first-time buyers, so it must be true, eh? But I do think a sensible question is to sit here and go, well, if your charts are right, Damien, why is it that so many first-time buyers are really battling to get on the ladder still? The answer, I think, is simply deposit requirements. A 10% deposit on the UK average home is £27,000. That is a massive amount of money for people to save in early life. Estimates have it that it will take people 6 to 7 years. That'd be about £375 a month for nearly half a decade, all the while praying that house prices don't move away from you. I think the reality is that many first-time buyers can afford the mortgage payments. It's often less than the rent that they would pay, but the hurdle remains. The biggest hurdle is the deposit requirements, and many individuals only get there because of family assistance. Nearly 40% of all first-time buyers get on the ladder with help from family, a gift, a loan, or inheritance. We need to think of a solution for this deposit hurdle for first-time buyers. One I'd like to float today is the idea of putting a charge on people's pensions. So we know that individuals in the modern world are typically auto-enrolled into a workplace pension, and they will contribute to that every single month, and they will acquire assets over a working career. Maybe we could look at that earlier on and say, well, we could reduce the deposit requirements on the basis of a charge against that or some kind of accessing of that money. I'm reluctant to take money out of the pension. I don't want onerous charges that have ridiculous interest rates that squander all of the pension benefits away over time. And I do think there are some things to consider. Is it just going to juice house prices because of affordability improves for this cohort? But we need to do something, and I think the pension is one potential thing. And I also think it would have the added benefit of improving the engagement in pensions amongst younger people, because it no longer is this abstract pot of money that they won't touch for decades. It becomes the vehicle to get them on the housing ladder, so they're going to like it a lot. Again, not well thought out, but just throwing up a suggestion there. There isn't the current preferred schemes, which tend to be things like the LISA, which is getting scrapped, which are just, oh, we will give you extra money for the deposit. Yeah, if you've got other suggestions, leave them in the comments below. I mentioned rent a few times in that section of the video, so I want to focus on rents now. The annual figure for growth in private rents is 4.0% to £1,368 in the 12 months to December 2025, which is down from 4.4%. In May of this year, we'll see the Renters' Right Bill come into force, which will shake up the whole industry, especially around the ability to increase rents.
In future, all rent increases in the private rented sector will be made using the same process. Landlords will be able to increase rents once per year to the market rate, the price that would be achieved if the property was newly advertised to let.
What this prevents, I guess, is landlords essentially going to a tenant, I'm going to double your rent in order to force them out. The tenant has the ability to challenge this via a tribunal. Now, I wonder if tenants will even be aware that they can do this, and I also wonder how speedy will that process be. I see articles stating that court dates for property issues at the minute can take as long as 30 weeks. Has the government got the capacity to see through the changes it's making in a timely manner that doesn't just create more issues for everyone? I mean, we shall see, won't we? But if you're a tenant and you feel that your rent is being increased above the market rate, you will be able to dispute this from May. But even just letting your landlord know that you could do that is probably going to be enough for them to be receptive, because of the fact that this is probably going to be an expensive and slow process. I think where the rental data is more interesting though is not the national stuff, it's the regional. First of all, in England, the average rent is up 3.9%, or £54 to £1,424. Whereas in Wales, it's gone up £45 to £822, so 5.7%. The Scottish increase was the lowest at 2.8%, and in Northern Ireland, again, it's up a lot, 5.7% or £47 on 873 a month. The differences across those four places shows the massive issue with the average figure. To suggest to someone in Wales that the average rent there is £1,368 a month is a gross misrepresentation of their market. So if we zoom in again, just on England this time, but by region, we see how high rent increases are in places like the North East at 7.9%. Whereas London has had the lowest increase. London having the lowest increase is not a sentence often said relating to housing in my lifetime. But this is the trend in rents, and it is 100% the trend in house prices, where London is actually a region in decline. As you can see, London is currently the only region where house price growth is going backwards. But look at the North East and the North West. But also don't forget that this is during a period where inflation is relatively high. So there's a double impact on this decline in London. If we adjust all of this for the current 3.6% CPIH inflation rate, only the North is growing in real terms right now. This is the real story of the housing market in England at the minute. For the first time in my life, really, growth has been driven mostly by the North, and London and the South are slipping a bit. I think what we're seeing here shouldn't really be put up though or framed as a collapse in the South. It's more of a rebalancing. First of all, just look at the numbers from the previous month. So we see that the rate of decline in London has slowed down, and that the Southwest was negative and now it's positive. Framing this as London is burning is probably a bit of an exaggeration, because the rate of decline is currently slowing down. But the truth remains that London was, and still is in many cases, unaffordable for would-be homeowners. And for investors, the numbers simply don't stack up there anymore. The North represents a better opportunity to generate a return for those investors, and for home buyers, prospective regions like the North West, namely Greater Manchester, provide an attractive place to live and work. You also have the whole remote work thing widening up the UK for people. So for decades, really, we've had this concentration of capital and people, talent and job opportunity in the South. And I think what we're seeing is a spreading out from London to the rest of England. I also don't think it's a coincidence that some of the cheapest areas to both rent in the UK, in Wales, and to buy in the North East are seeing the largest percentage gains. And while that's all pretty interesting, I do just think that your lived experience and the market that you operate in is really what matters when discussing property relevant to you. I look at this average growth figure of the Northwest as a region, and I think personally that that's low. I know areas where the prices have gone up 15% in the last 12 months. And where I live, which I assume has similar characteristics to where you live, crossing over a road or just simply changing the postcode slightly can mean a massive difference in price. Or that end of the road is a little bit rough, whereas this end is nice, so it's much more expensive at this end. The national averages we've looked at and even the regional data does nothing to capture the reality on the ground of localised markets like that. I would encourage you to really focus in on a few miles around where you want to live and what's going on there. That is the market to you. That's the one that matters. But for decades, the story of UK property was pretty simple. London leads, everywhere else sort of follows. What this data is showing us is that that story might be changing.